September 26, 1983, 12:14 a.m. Serpukhov 15, a secret bunker southwest of Moscow. In a dimly lit command center buried deep beneath the Soviet countryside, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov sat at his post, monitoring the early warning system designed to detect American nuclear missile launches. Around him, the low hum of computers and the quiet murmur of his shift crew created the ordinary background noise of a routine night shift. Then, suddenly, everything changed. A piercing siren shattered the quiet. Red lights blazed across the control panel. On the main screen, a single word flashed in stark Cyrillic letters: Zapusk, launch. The computer system, Oko, Russian for I, was reporting that the United States had launched a nuclear missile, one intercontinental ballistic missile, streaking toward the Soviet Union at 15,000 miles per hour, carrying a nuclear warhead capable of obliterating an entire city. Petrov's heart rate spiked. Around him, officers jumped to their stations. Protocol was clear. He had minutes, perhaps only seconds, to report this to Soviet military command, who would then inform the Soviet leadership, who would launch a retaliatory nuclear strike against the United States before American missiles could destroy the USSR's ability to respond. This was it. The moment every Cold War officer had trained for and prayed would never come: nuclear war. But then Petrov looked at the screen again. Something didn't feel right. One missile. Just one. If the Americans were really launching a nuclear first strike, attempting to destroy the Soviet Union's ability to retaliate before they could respond, they would launch everything at once. Hundreds of missiles, overwhelming Soviet defenses, attempting to destroy command centers and missile silos before the USSR could launch its own devastating response. One missile made no sense at all. Petrov's hand hovered over the phone that would connect him directly to Soviet military command. He had seconds to decide. Report the launch and set in motion events that would likely end human civilization, or trust his instinct that something was wrong, violate protocol, and potentially allow Soviet cities to be destroyed while he hesitated. In that moment, in that underground bunker, with alarms screaming and his crew looking to him for orders, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov made a decision that would save the world, though almost no one would know about it for decades. He did nothing. To understand the weight of that decision, the impossible pressure of that moment, we must first understand the world of 1983, the Cold War that had brought humanity to the brink of annihilation, and the man who found himself standing between civilization and nuclear holocaust. The Cold War in 1983. By 1983, the Cold War had been raging for nearly 4 decades. The United States and the Soviet Union, allies during World War II, had become bitter enemies in the years that followed, each leading opposing blocs in a global struggle that touched every continent and threatened to engulf humanity in nuclear fire. The fundamental conflict was ideological. The United States represented capitalism, democracy, and individual freedom. The Soviet Union represented communism, centralized planning, and collective ownership. Each side believed their system was morally superior and historically inevitable. Each side believed the other represented an existential threat not just to their nation, but to their way of life. This ideological conflict had manifested in multiple ways over the decades. The Berlin blockade in 1948, the Korean War in the 1950s, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s, proxy wars in Africa and Central America. The world had been divided into spheres of influence, with both superpowers supporting friendly governments and opposing hostile ones, sometimes through covert action, sometimes through direct military intervention. But underlying all these conventional conflicts was the nuclear threat. Both the United States and Soviet Union possessed massive arsenals of nuclear weapons, thousands of warheads, each many times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These weapons were mounted on intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach the opposite side of the world in 30 minutes, on submarines lurking in the depths of the oceans, on bombers standing ready to take off at a moment's notice. The doctrine governing these weapons was called mutually assured destruction, appropriately abbreviated as MAD. The logic was grimly simple. If either side launched nuclear weapons, the other side would detect the launch and retaliate before the incoming missiles arrived. Both nations would be utterly destroyed. Millions, perhaps hundreds of millions, would die in the initial strikes. Millions more would die from radiation, from the collapse of infrastructure, from starvation and disease in the aftermath. The resulting nuclear winter, dust and debris thrown into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, might render the Earth uninhabitable for years or decades. Knowing this, the theory went, neither side would dare launch nuclear weapons. The certainty of mutual destruction would prevent either side from starting a nuclear war. Peace would be maintained through the promise of apocalypse. It was a theory that depended entirely on rational actors making clear-headed decisions based on accurate information. And by 1983, that theory was being tested as never before. The dangerous year. Historians who study the Cold War often point to 1983 as one of the most dangerous years in human history, a year when the world came closer to nuclear war than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Several factors contributed to this heightened danger. First, relations between the United States and Soviet Union had deteriorated significantly. The period of detente, relaxation of tensions, that had characterized the 1970s had given way to renewed hostility. President Ronald Reagan, who took office in January 1981, took a hard-line stance toward the Soviet Union, calling it an evil empire and launching a massive military buildup. The Soviets, struggling economically and bogged down in their disastrous war in Afghanistan, viewed Reagan's rhetoric and military expansion with alarm. To Soviet leaders, it looked like the United States was preparing for war, building up military forces not for deterrence, but for a potential first strike. Second, the nuclear balance was shifting in ways that made both sides nervous. The United States was deploying new intermediate-range missiles in Europe, Pershing II missiles that could reach the Soviet Union in just 6 to 8 minutes, too fast for adequate warning. The Soviets saw these missiles as first-strike weapons, designed to destroy Soviet command and control before the USSR could respond. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had deployed its own intermediate-range missiles, SS-20s, targeting Western Europe. NATO countries felt threatened, creating a spiral of deployments and counter-deployments that increased tensions and shortened warning times. Third, there had been a series of incidents and near misses that had frayed nerves on both sides. In September 1983, just weeks before Petrov's fateful night shift, Soviet fighters had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian airliner that had strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people aboard, including a U.S. congressman. The incident, which the Soviets claimed was a spy mission and the West called cold-blooded murder, had further poisoned relations. Fourth, both sides were genuinely afraid. Soviet leaders, many of them elderly men who had lived through World War II and the devastation of the Nazi invasion, had a deeply ingrained fear of attack from the West. They interpreted American military exercises, weapons deployments, and Reagan's rhetoric as signs that the United States might be preparing for nuclear war. American leaders, meanwhile, were convinced the Soviet Union was expansionist and aggressive, pointing to the invasion of Afghanistan, support for communist movements worldwide, and continued military buildup despite economic problems. They believed the Soviets might take desperate action, might launch a first strike if they felt cornered or believed they could win. Into this atmosphere of mutual fear and suspicion, both sides had poured resources into early warning systems, satellites, radars, computer networks designed to detect enemy missile launches and provide warning of attack. These systems were meant to prevent surprise attacks, to give leaders time to respond, to maintain the balance of mutually assured destruction. But these systems, as Stanislav Petrov would discover, were not infallible. The man at the center. Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov was born on September 7, 1939, Vladivostok, a port city on the Soviet Union's Pacific coast. His birth came just days after World War II began in Europe with the German invasion of Poland, though the Soviet Union would not enter the war until 1941. Petrov's father was a fighter pilot in the Soviet Air Force. His mother worked in a factory. The family was thoroughly Soviet, patriotic, believing in the communist system, committed to defending their homeland. When Petrov was young, his father's military service meant the family moved frequently, living on various air bases across the Soviet Union. This military upbringing shaped Petrov's worldview and career path. From childhood, he was immersed in military culture, understanding the importance of discipline, duty, and service to the state. It was natural that he would follow his father into military service, but Petrov's path was different from his father's. Instead of becoming a pilot, he was drawn to technology and engineering. He attended the Kiev Higher Engineering Radio Technical College of the Soviet Air Forces, studying computer technology and radar systems. This was the 1960s, when computers were massive room-sized machines, when programming was done with punch cards, when the integration of computers into military systems was still in its early stages. Petrov excelled in his studies. He had a gift for understanding complex systems, for seeing how different components work together, for troubleshooting problems. After graduation, he was assigned to work on early warning systems, the Soviet Union's first line of defense against nuclear attack. This was prestigious, important work. The early warning system was crucial to Soviet defense strategy. Without adequate warning of American missile launches, the Soviet Union couldn't execute a retaliatory strike before incoming missiles destroyed their command structure and missile silos. The early warning system, therefore, was essential to maintaining the balance of terror that kept the peace. Petrov spent years working on these systems, rising through the ranks, eventually becoming a lieutenant colonel. By 1983, he was one of the senior officers responsible for monitoring the Oko satellite system, which used infrared sensors to detect the heat signatures of missile launches from space. His colleagues described him as thoughtful, careful, and meticulous. Unlike some military officers who relied purely on regulations and protocol, Petrov thought deeply about his work, questioned assumptions, and tried to understand not just the how of the systems he operated, but the why behind them. Stanislav was different from many officers, recalled Mikhail Grigoriev, who served with Petrov in the early 1980s. Most officers were content to follow procedures, to do exactly what the manual said. But Stanislav wanted to understand everything. He would ask questions. Why is the system designed this way? What are its limitations? What could go wrong? Some commanders found him annoying, found him brilliant. This questioning nature, this insistence on understanding rather than blindly following rules, would prove crucial on the night of September 26, 1983, life in the Soviet Union. To understand Petrov's decision that night, it helps to understand what life was like in the Soviet Union in 1983, particularly for someone in his position. The Soviet Union of 1983 was a society in decline, though few inside the country fully recognized it yet. The communist system, which had promised to create a workers' paradise, had instead created a stagnant, inefficient economy. Consumer goods were scarce and often of poor quality. Food shortages were common. People waited in long lines for basic necessities. The political system was ossified, controlled by aging leaders who had risen through the Communist Party ranks during the Stalin era. Leonid Brezhnev had died in November 1982 after 18 years in power, to be replaced by Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief. Andropov was 68 and in poor health. He would die in February 1984, just 15 months into his leadership. This leadership instability, combined with economic stagnation and the ongoing disaster in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union's Vietnam, created a sense of unease and uncertainty. The Soviet people, bombarded with propaganda about Western aggression and the need to defend the socialist motherland, lived with a constant low-level anxiety about war. For military officers like Petrov, life was somewhat better than for average Soviet citizens. Military families had access to better housing, better food rations, and better medical care. There were special stores where military personnel could buy goods unavailable to civilians. These privileges were the Soviet system's way of ensuring the loyalty of the military, the ultimate guarantor of the communist state's survival. But even officers lived under constraints that would be unimaginable in the West. Every aspect of life was monitored. The KGB maintained files on all military personnel, watching for any signs of disloyalty or ideological deviation. Officers who expressed doubts about the system, who questioned official narratives, or who showed too much interest in Western ideas could find their careers destroyed and their families suffering. Travel outside the Soviet Union was virtually impossible except on official business, and even then heavily monitored. Information from the West was filtered through state censorship. While some Western radio broadcasts, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, could be heard if you had the right radio and were willing to risk being caught listening to enemy propaganda, most Soviets' understanding of the West came through official Soviet media, which portrayed Western nations as aggressive, decadent, and preparing for war against the peace-loving Soviet Union. For someone like Petrov working in a highly classified facility, the restrictions were even more severe. He couldn't discuss his work with family or friends. The bunker where he worked didn't officially exist. If asked what he did, he had to give vague answers about military administration. The psychological weight of this secrecy, combined with the enormous responsibility of his position, was substantial. Petrov and his colleagues literally held the power to end human civilization. If they made an error, if they reported a false alarm as a real attack, they could trigger a nuclear war. If they failed to report a real attack, Soviet cities could be destroyed before the leadership could respond. Living with that responsibility, day after day, year after year, took a toll. Some officers cracked under the pressure, requesting transfers or developing stress-related illnesses. Others became rigid, following procedures with mechanical precision as a way to avoid the burden of personal responsibility. If you just followed the rules, you could tell yourself that any consequences weren't your fault. You were just doing your job. Petrov, characteristically, took a different approach. He tried to truly understand the systems he operated, to recognize their limitations, to maintain his own judgment even while following military discipline. This approach would serve him well on September 26, 1983, though it would ultimately cost him his career. The Oko system. The early warning system that Petrov monitored that night was called Oko, Russian for eye. It represented the cutting edge of Soviet military technology, a constellation of satellites equipped with infrared sensors designed to detect the heat signatures of missile launches. The concept was straightforward. When an intercontinental ballistic missile launches, its rocket engines produce an enormous amount of heat, thousands of degrees. This heat signature is visible from space, particularly against the cold background of the Earth as seen from orbit. Satellites equipped with sensitive infrared sensors can detect these heat plumes, and through computer analysis determine whether a missile launch has occurred and where it's headed. The United States had developed similar satellite early warning systems in the 1970s. The Soviets, always working to match or exceed American capabilities, had developed Oko in the late 1970s and early 1980s. By 1983, the system was operational, but still relatively new, still working out technical issues. The satellites transmitted their data to ground stations, where computers analyzed the information and displayed it to human operators. At Serpukhov 15, the secret bunker where Petrov worked, officers monitored large screens showing the satellite's view of likely launch areas, particularly the central United States, where many American missile silos were located. The system was designed to provide 15 to 20 minutes of warning, enough time for Soviet leaders to order a retaliatory strike before incoming American missiles could destroy the Soviet Union's ability to respond. This was the logic of nuclear deterrence. Even if the Americans struck first, the Soviets could still destroy American cities in retaliation, making the first strike pointless. But the Oko system, like all complex technologies, had limitations and potential failure modes that weren't fully understood by those who operated it. The satellite's infrared sensors could be fooled by other heat sources, forest fires, industrial facilities, even sunlight reflecting off clouds under certain conditions. The computer algorithms that analyzed sensor data and determined whether a launch had occurred were sophisticated but not infallible. They relied on assumptions and parameters set by programmers who had to balance sensitivity, detecting real launches, against specificity, avoiding false alarms. Too sensitive, and the system would report false launches, potentially triggering nuclear war over nothing. Not sensitive enough, and it might miss real launches, leaving the Soviet Union vulnerable to surprise attack. The designers had tried to strike a balance, but they were working with imperfect information, limited computing power by today's standards, and technology that was still being refined. The OCO system had been operational for only a short time, and its reliability under all conditions was still uncertain. Petrov understood these limitations better than most. As someone who had worked on early warning systems for years, who had studied their technical specifications and their failure modes, he knew that the system could make mistakes. He knew that a report of missile launch, while serious, was not necessarily accurate. This knowledge, this understanding of the system's fallibility, would be crucial in the early morning hours of September 26, 1983. The night shift, September 25, 1983, had been a typical day for Stanislav Petrov. He woke in his apartment in a military housing complex, had breakfast with his wife Raisa, and prepared for work. He wasn't scheduled to work that night. September 26th was supposed to be his day off, but another officer had called in sick, and Petrov had been asked to cover the shift. It was an inconvenience, but not unusual. In the military, you went where you were needed, worked when you were told to work. Petrov agreed to take the shift and made his way to Serpukhov 15. The facility was located about 60 miles southwest of Moscow, deliberately positioned away from the capital to reduce the risk of it being taken out in a first strike. The bunker itself was deep underground, accessed through a series of security checkpoints that verified identity and clearance level. Inside, the main command room was kept dim to make the computer screens easier to read. Banks of monitors displayed data from the OCO satellites, lights indicated system status, phones provided communication with other facilities, and most importantly, with Soviet military command in Moscow. Petrov's shift began at midnight. He relieved the previous duty officer, reviewed the status logs, and settled in for what he expected to be a routine night. His crew, about a dozen officers and enlisted personnel, manned various stations, monitoring different aspects of the early warning system. The atmosphere was quiet, professional, perhaps a bit drowsy. It was hard to stay alert during night shifts when nothing was happening, when hour after hour passed with no activity beyond routine system checks and status reports. Some officers read books or magazines between checks. Others chatted quietly about sports, family, the usual topics that people discuss to pass time. Petrov, characteristically, studied technical manuals and system specifications. Even after years of working with these systems, he continued trying to deepen his understanding, to grasp every nuance of how they operated. Around 12:14 a.m., just 14 minutes into his shift, everything changed. The first alarm. The siren was deafening in the confined space of the command center. Red lights blazed across Petrov's control panel. On the main screen, the word "Launch" appeared in bright red letters. Around him, officers jumped to their stations, their drowsiness instantly replaced by adrenaline-fueled alertness. Training took over. Everyone knew exactly what they were supposed to do in this scenario. Petrov's heart pounded as he scanned the displays. The OCO system was reporting a single missile launch from the United States. The computer had detected an infrared signature consistent with an ICBM launch and had assessed the detection as highly reliable. Protocol was absolutely clear. When the early warning system detected an enemy missile launch, the duty officer was to immediately report it to Soviet military command using the direct phone line, the red phone, that connected Serpukhov 15 to military headquarters in Moscow. The military command would then notify the Soviet leadership, who would make the decision on whether to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike. Time was critical. An ICBM launched from the central United States would reach the Soviet Union in approximately 30 minutes. But Soviet leaders would need time to be briefed, to make decisions, to issue orders. And the Soviet Union's retaliatory missiles needed to launch before incoming American missiles could destroy the silos and command centers. This meant Petrov had minutes, perhaps only seconds, to report the detection. Every moment of delay reduced the time available for Soviet leaders to respond, potentially leaving the USSR vulnerable to nuclear attack without the ability to retaliate. Petrov's hand moved toward the red phone. His crew waited for his order, their faces tense in the red glare of the alarm lights. But something made him pause. One missile. The system was reporting just one missile. "Confirm the detection," Petrov ordered his crew. "Check all parameters." Officers worked frantically at their stations, pulling up additional data, verifying the satellite readings, checking the computer's analysis. The seconds ticked away, seconds that should have been used to report the launch to Moscow. "The system shows high confidence," one officer reported. "The infrared signature is consistent with an SS-19 or similar ICBM." An SS-19 was a Soviet missile. The officer meant the signature matched what they would expect from a large, liquid-fueled ICBM, the Americans' Titan II, perhaps, or Minuteman. The signature was clear, strong, exactly what they had been trained to look for. "Just one missile?" Petrov asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Yes, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel. One missile launched from central United States, trajectory consistent with targeting Moscow or Leningrad." Petrov stared at the screen. His military training, years of conditioning, the direct orders he had received countless times, all of it demanded that he pick up the red phone and report the launch immediately. But his analytical mind, his understanding of military strategy, told him something different. "It doesn't make sense," Petrov said, almost to himself. "If the Americans are attacking, why one missile?" "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel," one of his officers said, his voice tight with stress, "protocol requires immediate reporting. We must call Moscow now." "I know the protocol," Petrov said, his eyes never leaving the screen. "But think about it. One missile. The Americans have thousands. If they're really attacking, if they've decided to launch a first strike, they would launch everything at once. They would try to overwhelm our defenses, destroy our ability to retaliate. One missile makes no strategic sense." "Perhaps it's a test, a provocation," another officer suggested. "Or perhaps," Petrov said quietly, "it's a system error." The crew fell silent. The possibility that the system had malfunctioned, that the alarm was false, was both hopeful and terrifying. Hopeful because it meant nuclear war might not be starting. Terrifying because if the alarm was real and they failed to report it, the consequences would be catastrophic. Petrov's mind raced through possibilities. The OCO system was sophisticated but not perfect. Infrared sensors could be fooled. Computer algorithms could misinterpret data. The system was still relatively new, still being refined. There had been false alarms before, though never one assessed as highly reliable by the computer. But military strategy was clearer. If the United States was launching a nuclear first strike, attempting to destroy the Soviet Union before it could respond, they would launch hundreds of missiles simultaneously. A massive, overwhelming attack designed to destroy Soviet command and control, eliminate missile silos, and prevent retaliation. One missile? That wasn't a first strike. That was either a test, a provocation, or, most likely, an error. "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel," the officer at the communication station said urgently, "we must report. If we delay and the missile is real." "I'm aware of the consequences," Petrov cut him off. Then, more gently, "Continue monitoring. Check all systems. Verify the satellite readings. I need to be absolutely certain before I report anything." Time stretched out, each second feeling like an hour. Petrov knew that with every passing moment, he was violating protocol more deeply, reducing the time available for Soviet leaders to respond if the missile was real. If he was wrong, if this was a real American attack and he failed to report it, he would be responsible for leaving the Soviet Union defenseless. Soviet cities could be destroyed, millions could die, and it would be his fault for hesitating, for trusting his judgment over the clear warning from the computer system. But if he was right, if this was a false alarm and he reported it as a real attack, he might trigger a nuclear war. Soviet leaders, already nervous and suspicious of American intentions, might order a retaliatory strike. American cities would be destroyed. The United States would launch its own retaliation. The nuclear exchange would escalate. Hundreds of millions would die in the initial strikes. Nuclear winter might follow, ending human civilization. The weight of that decision, the fate of the world literally in his hands, was almost unbearable. And then, just as Petrov was beginning to think he couldn't wait any longer, that he would have to make a choice one way or another, the alarm sounded again. The screen flashed. Launch, 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 launch. 4 more missiles. The system was now reporting 5 incoming American ICBMs. Petrov's blood ran cold. 5 missiles. This changed the calculation. This looked more like an attack, more like the beginning of something bigger. His hand moved to the red phone. The impossible choice. 5 missiles now. The screen showed 5 distinct infrared signatures, 5 trajectories arcing toward the Soviet Union, 5 nuclear warheads that would strike in approximately 25 minutes. The command center erupted in controlled chaos. Officers shouted reports confirming the detections, verifying the data. The computer's assessment remained highly reliable. Every technical indicator suggested this was real. Petrov's crew looked to him, waiting for the order that would set in motion the machinery of nuclear retaliation. The protocol was clear, had been drilled into them countless times. Detect enemy launch, verify detection, report immediately to Moscow command. But Petrov still hesitated, his hand hovering over the red phone. 5 missiles, more than 1 certainly, but still. 5 missiles, Petrov said aloud, his voice cutting through the noise. The Americans have over 1,000 ICBMs. We know this from intelligence reports. If they're launching a first strike, if they're really trying to destroy us before we can respond, why only 5 missiles? His deputy, Captain Mikhail Frolov, a career officer who believed deeply in following orders, spoke with barely controlled urgency. Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, with respect, we cannot speculate about American strategy. The system has detected launches, multiple launches. We must report immediately. What targets would 5 missiles hit? Petrov asked, addressing the question to the tactical analysis officer. The officer consulted his displays. Based on trajectories, Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Minsk, and... He paused, checking. Possibly Sevastopol or a command bunker. High-value targets, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel. Decapitation strike against leadership and command. It made a certain sense. 5 missiles aimed at the most critical Soviet leadership and command facilities. Take out the ability to coordinate a response, create chaos, perhaps make follow-up strikes easier, but it still didn't fully add up to Petrov. A decapitation strike requires certainty of success, Petrov said, his mind working through the strategic implications even as the seconds ticked away. 5 missiles against 5 targets, when we have anti-ballistic missile defenses around Moscow and other key cities? The Americans would know some missiles might be intercepted. If they're really trying to destroy our leadership, they would launch dozens of missiles per target to ensure penetration of defenses. Perhaps the rest are coming, another officer suggested. Perhaps this is just the first wave. Then we wait, Petrov said. If more launches are detected, if this becomes the massive attack we would expect, then we report it all at once. But right now this still doesn't match the pattern of an actual first strike. Captain Frolov's face was pale, his voice strained. Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, I must protest. We are violating direct orders. Every second we delay. I'm aware of what we are doing, Captain, Petrov said, his voice hard now. And I'm also aware that if I pick up that phone and report this as a real attack, I may start a nuclear war that will kill hundreds of millions of people. I need more time to assess. We don't have more time, Frolov said, his voice rising. The missiles are already in flight, in 20 minutes. Check the satellite data again, Petrov interrupted. I want verification from multiple satellites. I want to know if our ground-based radars have detected anything. I want every possible confirmation before I report this. The crew worked frantically. Petrov watched them, watched the displays, and tried to quiet the terror in his own mind long enough to think clearly. The situation was impossible. If he reported the launches and they were real, he would have done his duty. would have given Soviet leaders the warning they needed to respond. But if the launches were false alarms, system errors, and he reported them as real, he might trigger the exact nuclear war he was trying to prevent. The Soviet leadership was already nervous, already suspicious of American intentions. If they received word that American missiles were incoming, they might not wait to verify. They might order immediate retaliation, believing they had only minutes before American warheads destroyed their ability to respond. And once Soviet missiles launched, the Americans would detect them and launch their own full retaliation. The exchange would escalate beyond any possibility of control. Mutually assured destruction would become mutually actual destruction. Conversely, if he didn't report the launches and they were real, Soviet leaders would have no warning. American nuclear warheads would strike Moscow and other cities without any opportunity for retaliation. The Soviet Union would be decapitated, its leadership killed, its command structure destroyed. Both choices led to catastrophe. Report and risk starting a nuclear war. Don't report and risk leaving the Soviet Union defenseless. Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, the radar analysis officer called out. Ground-based radars are not detecting any missiles. Repeat, ground radars show nothing. Petrov's head snapped toward the officer. Nothing? No confirmation at all? No, sir. The over-the-horizon radars that cover the approach paths from the United States show no incoming missiles. Only the satellite system is detecting launches. This was significant. The OCO satellite system was the first line of detection, using infrared sensors to spot missile launches from space. But the Soviet Union also had ground-based radar systems that would detect incoming missiles as they approached Soviet airspace. These systems used different technology, different sensors, different methods of detection. If the missiles were real, both systems should detect them, satellites seeing the launches, radars seeing the incoming warheads as they approached. But if only the satellites were detecting something, if the ground radars showed nothing. It's a false alarm, Petrov said quietly, certainty growing in his voice. It has to be. The satellites are detecting something, but it's not missiles. The ground radars would confirm if missiles were really incoming. The ground radars might not have detected them yet, Captain Frolov argued, unwilling to abandon protocol. The missiles are still in boost phase, still over the Atlantic. Frolov, Petrov said, turning to face his deputy, if you were the Americans, if you were launching a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union, how many missiles would you launch? Frolov hesitated, then said reluctantly, hundreds. Everything at once. Overwhelming strike. Exactly. Not 5. 5 missiles is not a first strike. It's either a very strange test or, far more likely, a system malfunction. The satellites are seeing something that looks like missile launches, but the ground radars detect nothing. This is a false alarm. You're betting the survival of the Soviet Union on that assessment, Frolov said quietly. I'm betting the survival of the world, Petrov replied. If I report this and I'm wrong, if the Soviet leadership orders retaliation for an attack, that isn't happening. We start World War III. I won't do that based on ambiguous data that doesn't match the expected pattern of a real attack. The command center had grown quiet, officers watching this exchange, waiting to see what would happen. They all understood the magnitude of what was being decided. Their duty officer was refusing to follow protocol, was making a judgment call that contradicted direct orders and years of training. If Petrov was right, he was saving the world. If he was wrong, he was dooming the Soviet Union. Continue monitoring, Petrov ordered. Watch for any additional launches, check all systems for malfunctions, and watch the ground radars. If they start detecting incoming missiles, inform me immediately. The minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an eternity. The screen still showed 5 missile trajectories. The computer still assessed the detection as highly reliable. But the ground radars continued to show nothing. Petrov did not pick up the red phone. He did not report the launches to Moscow command. He simply waited, trusting his analysis, trusting his instinct that this was not real. Around him, his crew operated their stations, monitoring data, checking systems, waiting. Some believed Petrov was right. Others thought he was making a catastrophic mistake. But all of them followed his orders, loyal to their commander even as he violated protocol. 15 minutes passed since the first alarm, then 20 minutes. According to the satellite data, the missiles should be approaching Soviet airspace now, should be detectable by ground radars. Still, the radars showed nothing. "No radar confirmation," the radar officer reported, his voice now carrying a note of relief. "If missiles were really incoming, we would be detecting them now." 25 minutes. The missiles should be beginning their terminal descent, their final approach to targets. Nothing on the radars. 30 minutes. Impact time for the first missile, according to the satellite data. Moscow still stood. No nuclear detonation, no blinding flash, no mushroom cloud, no devastation. "The alarm was false," Petrov said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline crash beginning to hit him. "The satellites detected something, but it wasn't missiles. Stand down from alert status." The crew began to relax, the tension draining from the room like air from a balloon. Officers looked at each other, some smiling with relief, others still shaken by how close they had come to… what? Nuclear war? Or just filing a false report? Petrov leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly now that the crisis had passed. He had made the right call. The missiles hadn't been real. His instinct had been correct, but he also understood the implications of what he'd done. He had violated direct orders. He had failed to report a missile detection that the system had assessed as highly reliable. He had used his own judgment rather than following protocol. In the Soviet military system, such initiative was not always rewarded. The aftermath begins. The rest of Petrov's shift passed in a strange combination of relief and anxiety. The false alarm had been survived, but now came the task of understanding what had happened and reporting it to higher authorities. Petrov ordered his crew to document everything, every reading from the satellites, every piece of data from the computers, the exact sequence of events. He wanted a complete record that could be analyzed to determine what had caused the false alarm. As dawn broke on September 26th, Petrov's shift ended and he briefed his relief, explaining the night's events. Word of the incident began spreading through the command structure. By mid-morning, senior officers were arriving at Serpukhov 15, demanding explanations. Petrov filed his official report, carefully documenting what had happened. He explained his reasoning for not reporting the launches to Moscow command. The small number of missiles detected, the lack of ground radar confirmation, the inconsistency with expected American first strike strategy. The reaction from his superiors was mixed. Some praised his cool-headed analysis under pressure. Others were horrified that he had violated protocol, that he had failed to immediately report detections that the system had flagged as highly reliable. "You understand you could have been wrong," one general said during the initial debriefing. "If those missiles had been real, if American warheads had struck while you hesitated to report, you would have been responsible for the deaths of millions of Soviet citizens." "I understand that, Comrade General," Petrov replied, "but I also understood that if I reported a false alarm as a real attack, I might start a nuclear war that would kill hundreds of millions. I assessed the probability that the detection was false based on strategic logic and the lack of radar confirmation. I believed and still believe that I made the correct decision." "You believed," the general repeated. "You made a judgment call rather than following orders." "Yes, Comrade General. The situation required judgment." The general studied him for a long moment. "Your judgment was correct this time, Lieutenant Colonel Petrov, but the Soviet military does not operate on individual judgment. It operates on orders, procedures, discipline. What you did was either heroic or insubordinate. Time will tell which." In the days that followed, technical experts descended on Serpukhov 15 to investigate the false alarm. They analyzed the satellite data, examined the computer algorithms, tried to determine what had caused the OCO system to detect missile launches when no launches had occurred. The investigation would take months, but the preliminary conclusion emerged within weeks. The satellites had detected sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds. Under specific conditions, the angle of the sun, the altitude and type of clouds, the position of the satellites, the infrared signature of sunlight on clouds, could resemble the heat signature of missile launches. It was a flaw in the system, a failure mode that the designers hadn't fully anticipated. The computer algorithms, trained to recognize missile launches, had interpreted the anomalous infrared data as exactly what they were programmed to detect. The OCO system had done what it was designed to do, detected what it thought were missile launches and alerted operators. It wasn't a malfunction in the traditional sense. It was a limitation of the technology, an edge case where the sensors and algorithms could be fooled by natural phenomena. The engineers began working on improvements, better algorithms, additional filters, redundant checks to reduce the possibility of false alarms. But they also understood that any detection system would have limitations, that there would always be some possibility of error. This was the fundamental problem with nuclear early warning systems. They had to be sensitive enough to detect real attacks, but specific enough to avoid false alarms. The consequences of failure in either direction were catastrophic. Miss a real attack, and your nation could be destroyed before it could respond. Report a false attack as real, and you might trigger nuclear war. Petrov had been caught at the intersection of these competing demands, and he had chosen to trust human judgment over computer assessment. He had been right this time, but the Soviet military leadership viewed his decision with deep ambivalence. The Soviet military's dilemma. The Soviet military faced a difficult problem in how to handle Petrov's actions. On one hand, he had likely prevented a catastrophic error, either a false report that could have triggered nuclear war, or at minimum, a serious diplomatic incident if Soviet leaders had been awakened in the middle of the night with false warnings of American attack. On the other hand, he had violated protocol, had failed to follow direct orders, and had substituted his own judgment for established procedures. In the Soviet system, such individual initiative was viewed with suspicion. The Soviet military, like militaries everywhere, operated on a strict hierarchy and chain of command. Orders flowed down from the top, and subordinates were expected to execute them without question. This system had certain advantages. It enabled large organizations to function efficiently, ensured that strategic decisions made by senior leadership would be implemented as intended, and prevented chaos that might result if every individual made their own choices. But this system also had disadvantages, particularly in situations requiring rapid response to ambiguous information. If operators were expected to blindly follow protocols without exercising judgment, they might make errors when protocols didn't perfectly match reality. The Petrov incident highlighted this tension. His superiors wanted officers who would follow orders reliably, but they also needed officers who could think critically, who could recognize when protocols weren't adequate, who could make difficult decisions under extreme pressure. Petrov represented both the ideal and the problem. He had the technical expertise and analytical ability they wanted, but he had also demonstrated a willingness to deviate from orders based on his own assessment, a trait that made the Soviet military hierarchy uncomfortable. General Yuri Votintsev, commander of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, which operated the early warning system, faced the political problem of how to explain the incident to his own superiors and ultimately to the Soviet leadership. The OCO system, which had cost enormous sums to develop and deploy, had generated a serious false alarm. This was embarrassing, raising questions about the system's reliability and the competence of those who had designed it. Votintsev needed to address these concerns while also defending his command. Moreover, the incident raised uncomfortable questions about the hair-trigger nature of nuclear deterrence. Soviet leaders had been told they would have adequate warning of American attack, time to make careful decisions about how to respond. But this incident revealed that warning might come in ambiguous forms, that decisions might need to be made in minutes, that a single officer's judgment call could determine whether nuclear war began. This reality was frightening to Soviet leaders who, for all their power, understood they might have only moments to make decisions that would affect the fate of humanity. They wanted systems that worked reliably, that provided clear and unambiguous warning, that didn't depend on individual officers making judgment calls. But such perfect systems didn't exist and probably couldn't exist. The technology wasn't reliable enough, the warning times were too short, and the stakes were too high. Someone, at some point, would need to make a judgment call based on incomplete information. Petrov had done exactly that, and he had been correct. But what if next time the officer in that position made the wrong call? These concerns percolated through the Soviet military and political hierarchy in the weeks after the incident. And gradually, a decision emerged about how to handle Stanislav Petrov, the silent treatment. If Petrov had expected recognition for his actions, he was disappointed. Instead of being decorated or promoted, he was quietly reassigned. He was removed from his position monitoring the early warning system and given a less critical role involving technical analysis and staff work. The official explanation was vague, something about optimizing personnel assignments and his technical expertise being better utilized elsewhere. But Petrov understood what was really happening. He was being sidelined, moved away from any position where he might need to make another judgment call that contradicted protocols. His superiors gave him no clear answer about whether his actions on September 26th had been considered appropriate or inappropriate. There was no formal commendation, but also no formal reprimand. He existed in a bureaucratic limbo, not quite punished, but certainly not rewarded. His colleagues' reactions were similarly mixed. Some, particularly those who had been in the command center that night, viewed him as a hero who had kept his head when others might have panicked. They quietly told him they thought he had done the right thing, that his analysis had been sound, that his decision had been correct. Others were more critical, arguing that he had gotten lucky, that his violation of protocol could have had catastrophic consequences if he had been wrong. These officers believed the system existed for a reason, that protocols should be followed even when they seemed wrong, because the alternative, everyone making individual decisions, would lead to chaos. The wider Soviet military knew nothing of the incident. The false alarm was classified at the highest levels. Only those directly involved or in senior command positions were aware of what had happened. For the vast majority of Soviet military personnel, September 26, 1983, had been just another day. This secrecy was deliberate. The Soviet leadership didn't want their own people, let alone the Americans, to know how close the world had come to nuclear war over a false alarm. Such knowledge would undermine confidence in Soviet military systems, might embolden American hawks who argued the Soviets were trigger-happy and unstable, and would raise uncomfortable questions about the reliability of nuclear deterrence. So the incident was buried in classified files, marked top secret, discussed only in closed meetings at the highest levels of Soviet command. Petrov returned to his routine, attending his new assignments, carrying out his duties with the same meticulous care he had always shown. But something had changed. He had seen too clearly the fragile thread on which human survival hung, had felt too directly the weight of decisions that could end civilization. He began having trouble sleeping. He would wake in the night, reliving those moments in the command center, wondering what would have happened if he had made a different choice. The nightmares weren't about having made the wrong decision. He remained convinced he had been right, but about the terrible responsibility, the impossible position he had been placed in. His wife Raisa noticed the change. "You seem different," she told him one evening. "More distant, more troubled. What happened?" But Petrov couldn't tell her. His work was classified. The incident was secret. He carried the burden alone, unable to share it even with his wife. "Just stress," he told her. "Nothing to worry about." But it was everything to worry about. Petrov had stared into the abyss, had held the fate of the world in his hands, and the experience had marked him permanently. 1984. Recognition. Denied. In April 1984, several months after the September incident, the investigation into the false alarm was completed. The technical experts had identified the cause, sunlight reflecting off clouds, and had recommended improvements to the OKO system to prevent similar false alarms. General Votintsev faced a decision about how to recognize or address Petrov's actions. A draft commendation was prepared, recommending Petrov for an award for his clear thinking and correct assessment under pressure. But the commendation was never approved. Senior officers in the Soviet military hierarchy, after reviewing the case, decided that recognizing Petrov would set a dangerous precedent. It would suggest that violating protocols was acceptable, that individual officers should trust their own judgment over established procedures. Moreover, recognizing Petrov would require explaining what he had done, which would mean acknowledging the false alarm more widely within the military and possibly even publicly. The Soviet leadership had no interest in such acknowledgement, so instead of receiving a medal or commendation, Petrov received nothing. The incident simply disappeared into classified archives, known only to a small circle of senior officers who had been briefed on it. Worse, Petrov became a somewhat controversial figure within the Soviet military establishment. Some officers blamed him for embarrassing the military by exposing flaws in the OKO system. The fact that his correct assessment had highlighted the system's limitations was perversely held against him. In a bureaucratic culture that valued covering up problems rather than exposing them, Petrov's actions had been unwelcome. He had forced senior officers to confront uncomfortable realities about nuclear command and control, about the reliability of early warning systems, about the terrible decisions that might need to be made in minutes. In 1984, facing increasing pressure and recognizing that his military career had effectively ended, Petrov took early retirement from the Soviet military. He was 45 years old, had served for over 20 years, and left with a modest pension, but without the recognition that his actions might have deserved. He found civilian work, eventually taking a position at a research institute involved in aerospace technology. It was comfortable but unremarkable work, far from the high-stakes responsibility of his military service. To his neighbors, his friends, his new colleagues, Stanislav Petrov was simply a former military officer, one of millions of veterans in the Soviet system. No one knew what he had done, what decision he had made, how his moment of judgment had potentially saved the world. And that's how it would remain for another decade and a half, as the Cold War continued, as tensions periodically rose and fell, as the nuclear arsenals of both superpowers remained poised for mutual destruction. The Cold War continues. The incident that Petrov had prevented from escalating into nuclear catastrophe remained secret, but the conditions that had created it persisted and, in some ways, intensified through the mid-1980s. Just 2 months after Petrov's fateful decision, in November 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise simulated the transition from conventional warfare to nuclear warfare, practicing the procedures NATO would use to authorize and coordinate nuclear strikes. Soviet intelligence, already nervous about Western intentions, interpreted the exercise as potentially real. The KGB sent urgent messages to Soviet leadership, warning that NATO might be using the exercise as cover for an actual first strike. Soviet nuclear forces were placed on high alert. Soviet bombers in East Germany were loaded with nuclear weapons and prepared for takeoff. For several days in November 1983, the world was again on the brink of nuclear war, this time because of a misunderstanding about a military exercise. The crisis passed when the exercise ended, and Soviet intelligence confirmed it had been just a drill. But historians would later recognize this as one of the most dangerous moments of the entire Cold War. If the Able Archer crisis had occurred before September 26th, if Soviet forces had been on high alert when Petrov's false alarm happened, his decision to not report the missile detections might have been much more difficult. In an atmosphere of heightened tension, with Soviet leadership already fearing American attack, a report of incoming missiles might have triggered immediate retaliation. This is the terrible reality of nuclear deterrence during the Cold War. The system depended on rational decision-making by leaders who had accurate information and adequate time to assess situations. But in practice, leaders often had incomplete or misleading information and only minutes to make decisions that would affect the fate of humanity. Petrov's incident and the Able Archer crisis both illustrated how fragile nuclear peace really was, how close the world came to catastrophe, not through deliberate aggression, but through misunderstanding, false alarms, and mutual fear. Yet these close calls remained secret for years. The public, in both the Soviet Union and the West, continued their daily lives largely unaware of how close they had come to annihilation. Perhaps this was for the best. Knowing might have created panic, but it also meant that the lessons of these near misses couldn't be learned or applied to make the system safer. the beginning of the end. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the effective leader of the country. Gorbachev, at 54, was younger and more reform-minded than his predecessors. He recognized that the Soviet system was failing, that economic stagnation threatened the USSR's ability to compete with the West, and that change was necessary. Gorbachev introduced policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, attempting to reform the Soviet system while preserving its basic structure. He also pursued arms control negotiations with the United States more seriously than previous Soviet leaders had done. President Ronald Reagan, initially skeptical of Soviet intentions, gradually became convinced that Gorbachev was genuinely interested in reducing tensions in nuclear arsenals. The two leaders met several times between 1985 and 1988, building a relationship that would lead to significant arms control agreements. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in 1987, eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. It was the first treaty that actually reduced nuclear arsenals rather than just limiting their growth. More importantly, it signaled that the Cold War might be ending, that the two superpowers might step back from the brink of mutual destruction. These changes were too late for Petrov's military career, but they validated his instincts. The fear and suspicion that had characterized Soviet-American relations in 1983 gradually gave way to cautious cooperation. The nuclear hair trigger, while still dangerous, became somewhat less sensitive as communication improved and tensions decreased. But even as relations improved, the secret of September 26, 1983, remained locked in classified Soviet archives. Petrov, living quietly in retirement, working at his civilian job, never spoke about what had happened. He had signed secrecy agreements, and even under glasnost, military matters remained sensitive. The world continued on, unaware that it had been saved by one man's decision to do nothing. The wall falls. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. For 28 years, the wall had symbolized the division of Europe, the Iron Curtain that separated communist East from capitalist West. Its fall, peaceful and largely spontaneous, marked the symbolic end of the Cold War. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself would collapse. The communist system, unable to reform quickly enough or effectively enough, simply disintegrated. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, replaced by 15 independent nations, the largest being the Russian Federation. The Cold War was over. The threat of nuclear holocaust that had hung over humanity for nearly half a century had not been eliminated. Russia and the United States still possessed massive nuclear arsenals, but it had diminished dramatically. The ideological conflict that had driven the arms race, that had brought the world to the brink of destruction multiple times, had ended. Petrov, like millions of other former Soviet citizens, faced the challenge of adapting to post-Soviet life. The institutions that had defined his existence, the Soviet military, the communist system, the Cold War rivalry with the West, were gone. Russia in the 1990s was chaotic, economically devastated, uncertain about its identity and future. Petrov's military pension, denominated in rubles, became nearly worthless as Russia experienced hyperinflation. He struggled financially, as did most Russians, adapting to a market economy after a lifetime in a command system. But something else changed in the post-Soviet era. Secrets began emerging. With the Soviet Union gone, with many classified archives becoming accessible, with former Soviet officers feeling free to speak, stories that had been suppressed for decades began to surface. And eventually, someone decided it was time to tell the story of what had happened on September 26, 1983. The secret emerges. The story of Stanislav Petrov's decision on September 26, 1983, first emerged publicly in 1998, 15 years after the incident and 7 years after the Soviet Union's collapse. A retired Russian general named Yuri Votintsev, who had been involved in the investigation of the false alarm, mentioned the incident in an interview with a Russian newspaper. He didn't name Petrov initially, but he described the event, the false alarm, the officer who hadn't reported it, the narrowly averted catastrophe. The story was picked up by other Russian journalists who began investigating. They tracked down officers who had been at Serpukhov 15 that night, pieced together what had happened, and eventually identified Petrov as the duty officer who had made the critical decision. When journalists first contacted Petrov in 1998, he was reluctant to discuss the incident. Even though the Soviet Union no longer existed, even though the secrecy agreements he had signed were technically void, he remained uncomfortable with publicity. He was a private man, not given to self-promotion, and he didn't consider what he had done to be particularly heroic. "I was just doing my job," he told the first journalist who interviewed him. "I analyzed the situation and made an assessment based on the available information. That's what officers are supposed to do." But as the story spread, as more details emerged, the full significance of his actions became clear. This wasn't just a competent officer making a good decision. This was a man who had potentially prevented nuclear war, who had held the fate of humanity in his hands and made the right choice. Western media picked up the story. In 1999, an American documentary filmmaker named Kevin Rafferty traveled to Russia to interview Petrov for a documentary about nuclear close calls during the Cold War. Petrov, still reluctant but persuaded by friends that the story was important, agreed to participate. Rafferty's documentary, The Man Who Saved the World, brought Petrov's story to international attention. The film interwove Petrov's account of September 26, 1983, with expert analysis of Cold War nuclear strategy, archival footage from the era, and discussions of other nuclear close calls. The documentary made clear how close the world had come to catastrophe, how a different officer, one more rigid, more inclined to follow protocol without question, might have reported the false alarm as real, potentially triggering a nuclear exchange that would have killed hundreds of millions. Western audiences were stunned. And throughout the Cold War, people had lived with the abstract knowledge that nuclear war was possible, that the superpowers had the capability to destroy each other. But this story made it concrete, showed exactly how it might have happened, how close it had come to happening, how one man's judgment had been all that stood between civilization and annihilation. Recognition in the West. As Petrov's story became known in the West, efforts began to recognize and honor his actions. Various organizations invited him to ceremonies and events seeking to acknowledge the man who had potentially saved the world. In 2004, the Association of World Citizens gave Petrov its World Citizens Award at a ceremony at the United Nations in New York. The citation read, "For preventing nuclear war by recognizing that a false alarm was not an actual enemy attack." At the ceremony, Petrov, now 65 years old, silver-haired and soft-spoken, addressed the audience with characteristic modesty. "I was simply doing my job, and I was fortunate that I was right," he said. "I often think about what could have happened if I had been wrong, if those had been real missiles. The weight of that responsibility is something I've carried ever since." Walter Cronkite, the legendary American journalist who had covered the Cold War for decades, also spoke at the ceremony. "We owe our lives to this man," Cronkite said. "Not in the abstract sense that we owe our freedom to veterans, though that is also true. We owe him our actual, physical existence. If Lieutenant Colonel Petrov had made a different decision on September 26, 1983, many of us would not be here today. Our children would never have been born. Our world would have ended in nuclear fire. Instead, we are here, alive, because one man kept his head when he had every reason to panic." Also in 2004, Petrov received the Dresden Peace Prize, awarded annually by a German organization to individuals who have contributed to peace. The ceremony was held in Dresden, the German city that had been devastated by Allied bombing in World War II, a city that understood the horrors of war, perhaps better than most. At the Dresden ceremony, Petrov was introduced to other recipients of peace awards, activists and diplomats who had worked to prevent conflicts and build bridges between hostile nations. But Petrov's contribution was unique. He hadn't worked for years on peace initiatives, hadn't negotiated treaties or organized movements. He had simply made one correct decision in a moment of crisis. "I am honored by this recognition," Petrov said in his acceptance speech in Dresden, But I'm also uncomfortable with it. I do not think of myself as a hero. Heroes are people who make conscious sacrifices, who choose to put themselves at risk for the benefit of others. I simply made a decision based on my analysis of the situation. Any competent officer should have done the same. This humility, this refusal to accept the label of hero, was characteristic of Petrov. Throughout his later life, as he received various awards and recognitions, he remained uncomfortable with the attention, insistent that he had simply done what the situation required. Life in post-Soviet Russia. While Western organizations honored Petrov, his life in Russia remained difficult. He lived on a small pension in a modest apartment in Fryazino, a town outside Moscow. The Russian government, preoccupied with economic crisis and political turmoil in the 1990s and early 2000s, showed little interest in recognizing Petrov's actions. Part of this indifference stemmed from embarrassment. Petrov's story highlighted flaws in Soviet military systems, showed how close the USSR had come to catastrophe through a combination of technical failure and organizational dysfunction. The Russian government, seeking to project strength and competence, had no interest in publicizing stories that suggested the opposite. Moreover, Petrov's decision to violate protocol, while correct, remained controversial within Russian military circles. Some retired officers praised him. Others argued that his refusal to follow orders set a dangerous precedent, that military discipline required following procedures even when they seemed wrong. In the military, you follow orders, one retired Russian general said in a 2006 interview. If every officer starts making his own decisions, ignoring protocols, you have chaos. Petrov was lucky that his judgment was correct. But what if it hadn't been? What if he had failed to report a real attack? We can't build a military on individuals making judgment calls. This perspective, while understandable from a military discipline standpoint, missed the larger point. Nuclear weapons and early warning systems created situations where rigid adherence to protocol could lead to catastrophe. The protocols themselves could be wrong, could fail to account for situations their designers hadn't anticipated. Petrov's financial situation in retirement was precarious. The hyperinflation of the 1990s had devastated his pension. He worked odd jobs, occasionally took consulting work related to his technical expertise, but struggled to make ends meet. Friends and colleagues from his military days sometimes helped when they could, but many of them faced similar economic difficulties. The collapse of the Soviet Union had been particularly hard on former military personnel, who found their skills and experience had little value in the new market economy. In 2006, Petrov's wife Raisa died after a long illness. Her death was devastating to Petrov, who had depended on her emotional support through the difficult post-Soviet years. He became more reclusive, spending increasing amounts of time alone in his apartment. When journalists or filmmakers contacted him for interviews, he sometimes agreed. Particularly if there was payment involved, the money helped with bills and expenses. But he never sought publicity, never tried to capitalize on his story beyond accepting speaking fees and awards that came with financial recognition. The Kevin Costner connection. One of the more unusual episodes in Petrov's later life involved the Hollywood actor Kevin Costner. In 2012, Costner was in Russia promoting a film and heard about Petrov's story. Moved by the account of what Petrov had done, Costner sought him out. The two men met in Moscow, an incongruous pairing, the wealthy Hollywood star and the retired Soviet officer living on a small pension. But they formed a genuine connection, united by Costner's sincere admiration for Petrov's actions. "This man saved my life, saved my children's lives, saved everyone I love," Costner said in an interview about meeting Petrov. "And he's living in poverty, largely forgotten. That seemed wrong to me." Costner presented Petrov with a special award, a World Citizen Award that Costner himself had commissioned, along with a substantial check to help with Petrov's financial situation. The gesture was genuinely kind, though the publicity around the meeting created uncomfortable attention for the private Petrov. Photographs from the meeting show Costner, energetic and emotional, embracing Petrov, while Petrov, more reserved, accepts the recognition with quiet dignity. The contrast in their circumstances, Costner's wealth and fame versus Petrov's modest circumstances, illustrated the strange ironies of history. The man who saved the world lived in obscurity and struggled financially, while actors who portrayed heroes became wealthy and famous. Costner later said the meeting was one of the most meaningful experiences of his life. "I've played heroes in movies, but meeting a real hero, someone who actually saved the world, puts everything in perspective. Nothing I've done in my career comes close to what Stanislav Petrov did in those few minutes in 1983. The historical debate. As Petrov's story became more widely known, historians and military analysts debated its significance and implications. Some argued that Petrov had indeed saved the world, that his decision not to report the false alarm had prevented a sequence of events that would have led to nuclear war. In this interpretation, Soviet leaders, receiving word of an American attack while already nervous about U.S. intentions, would likely have ordered a retaliatory strike. The Americans would have detected Soviet missiles launching and retaliated in turn. The exchange would have escalated beyond control. Others were more skeptical, arguing that even if Petrov had reported the false alarm, cooler heads might have prevailed at higher levels. Perhaps Soviet leaders would have demanded more verification before ordering retaliation. Perhaps they would have recognized the illogic of a 5-missile attack and questioned the report. Perhaps the system had more safeguards than critics assumed. We can't know what would have happened if Petrov had made a different choice. Historian David Hoffman, author of The Dead Hand, The Untold Story of the Cold War Arms Race, said in a 2009 interview, "We can speculate, but we can't know. What we do know is that the incident revealed serious flaws in Soviet early warning systems and decision-making processes. Those flaws could have led to catastrophe on September 26, 1983, or on some other day." The debate extended to questions about nuclear command and control more broadly. How many other close calls had there been that remained classified or unknown? How reliable were early warning systems on both sides? How close had the world come to nuclear war at other points during the Cold War? Research by historians revealed numerous other incidents where false alarms, technical glitches, or misunderstandings had created risks of nuclear war. In 1979, a U.S. early warning system detected a massive Soviet missile attack. Bombers were scrambled and missile crews placed on alert before someone discovered that a training tape simulating a Soviet attack had accidentally been loaded into the operational system. In 1980, a faulty computer chip caused U.S. systems to report Soviet missile launches on several occasions over a 3-day period. Each time, the error was discovered before any irreversible actions were taken. But the incidents highlighted the fragility of systems that humanity depended on to prevent nuclear war. In 1995, 4 years after the Cold War ended, Russian early warning systems detected the launch of a rocket from Norway. Russian President Boris Yeltsin was notified and reportedly opened the briefcase containing nuclear launch codes before advisors determined the rocket was a scientific probe that Norway had actually notified Russia about weeks earlier, a notification that had been lost in bureaucracy. These and other incidents suggested that Petrov's experience was not unique, that the Cold War had been even more dangerous than people realized, that humanity's survival through the nuclear age owed as much to luck and individual judgment as to careful planning and rational strategy. Educational legacy. As awareness of Petrov's story spread, it became incorporated into educational materials about the Cold War, nuclear deterrence, and conflict resolution. History teachers used the story to illustrate the human dimension of nuclear strategy, to show students that abstract concepts like mutually assured destruction had real implications, that real people made life-or-death decisions with incomplete information and limited time. Peace education programs used Petrov's example to discuss decision-making under pressure, the importance of critical thinking even in rule-bound systems, and the dangers of over-reliance on technology without human judgment. Military academies, somewhat ironically given Petrov's violation of protocol, began using the incident as a case study in leadership and decision-making. The question posed to officer candidates was nuanced. Should Petrov have followed protocol and reported the detected launches, or was his decision to use his own judgment correct? The debate this question generated was itself educational, forcing future officers to think about when rules should be followed and when they should be questioned, about balancing discipline with initiative, about making decisions when all available options seem to lead to disaster. Some military instructors argued that Petrov had gotten lucky, that his decision could have been catastrophically wrong, and that military discipline requires following orders. Others countered that rigid adherence to rules in a nuclear context could itself be catastrophic, that the complexity and stakes of nuclear command required thoughtful human judgment. The Petrov incident shows that we can't automate nuclear decision-making completely, argued Dr. Bruce Blair, a former U.S. missile launch officer who became a nuclear policy expert. We need humans in the loop because situations arise that the system designers didn't anticipate. But having humans in the loop means accepting that humans will make judgment calls, sometimes going against protocols. We have to be comfortable with that ambiguity because the alternative, pure automation or pure rigid rule following, is more dangerous. The psychological burden. Throughout his later life, Petrov carried the psychological weight of what he had experienced on September 26, 1983. In interviews, he spoke about the continuing impact of that night, the way it had shaped his understanding of himself and the world. "I think about it every day," Petrov said in a 2010 interview. "Not obsessively, but it's always there, in the background. The knowledge that I made a decision that affected the entire world, that billions of lives depended on me being right. It's not a burden I would wish on anyone." He described having nightmares for years after the incident, dreams where he made the wrong decision, where he reported the false alarm as real and watched nuclear war unfold. In these dreams, he would see mushroom clouds over cities, would hear the screams of millions dying, would know it was his fault for reporting something he should have recognized as false. The nightmares were worst in the late 1980s, he recalled. During the day, I could tell myself I had made the right decision, that my analysis had been correct. But at night, my subconscious would ask, what if you were wrong? What if you missed something? What if your judgment had failed? He also struggled with survivor's guilt of a peculiar kind. While he hadn't caused anyone's death, indeed, he had prevented millions of deaths, he felt guilty about the burden that had been placed on him, about the fact that human civilization had depended on his judgment. "No one should have to make that kind of decision," he said in a 2012 interview. "The system that put me in that position was fundamentally flawed. We had created weapons that could end human civilization, and we had built systems that required individual officers to make split-second decisions about whether to end the world. It's insane when you think about it clearly." This realization, that the entire structure of nuclear deterrence was built on assumptions that might not hold under real-world conditions, deeply troubled Petrov in his later years. He became an advocate for nuclear disarmament, arguing that as long as nuclear weapons existed, the risk of accidental or mistaken launch remained unacceptably high. "We were lucky in 1983, he said in a speech at a disarmament conference in 2006, but we cannot count on being lucky forever. Every day that nuclear weapons exist is another day when a technical failure, a misunderstanding, or a judgment error could end human civilization. The only true safety is to eliminate these weapons entirely." The Russian government's silence. Despite the international recognition Petrov received, the Russian government remained largely silent about his actions. There was no official acknowledgement from the Kremlin, no Russian decoration or award, no inclusion of his story in official military histories. This silence reflected several factors. First, acknowledging Petrov would require admitting that Soviet military systems had failed, that a catastrophic error had nearly occurred. Russian officials, particularly those in military and security services, had no interest in highlighting such failures. Second, Petrov's story complicated the narrative that Russia sought to project about its Soviet past. The Putin government in the 2000s and 2010s sought to rehabilitate the Soviet Union's reputation, emphasizing its achievements and downplaying its failures. The Petrov incident, which showed Soviet systems on the brink of starting an accidental nuclear war, didn't fit this narrative. Third, some Russian military and security officials genuinely disagreed with the Western interpretation of Petrov's actions. They argued that he had violated orders, that luck rather than judgment had saved him, and that celebrating his insubordination set a dangerous example. In 2013, on the 30th anniversary of the incident, several Russian media outlets ran stories about Petrov. Some were celebratory, praising his cool-headed decision-making. Others were more critical, questioning whether he deserved the hero label, noting that he had failed to follow procedures. The Russian Ministry of Defense declined to comment on the anniversary, stating only that personnel decisions from the Soviet era were not matters for current discussion. This official silence hurt Petrov, who hoped for some recognition from his own country. He had spent his career serving the Soviet military, had been trained and shaped by the Soviet system, and felt that his homeland owed him at least acknowledgement, if not gratitude. The Americans honor me. The Europeans give me awards, but my own country pretends I don't exist, Petrov said sadly in a 2013 interview. I don't need medals or parades, but some recognition that what I did mattered, that it was important. That would mean something to me. Friends who knew Petrov well said this lack of Russian recognition troubled him more than he publicly admitted. He was proud of his service, proud of being Russian, and wanted his country to acknowledge what he had done. The silence from Moscow felt like rejection, like his years of service and his crucial decision meant nothing to the nation he had served. Final years. Petrov's health began declining in the mid-2010s. Years of stress, the psychological burden of his experience, and the hardships of post-Soviet life had taken their toll. He suffered from hypertension and other ailments common in elderly men who had lived through difficult circumstances. He lived quietly in Friazino, his life simple and modest. Friends visited occasionally. Journalists still sought interviews from time to time, but increasingly, Petrov preferred solitude, spending time with his books and memories. In May 2017, at age 77, Stanislav Petrov died in his apartment. The cause was pneumonia, though his overall health had been failing for some time. He died alone, not discovered for several days until friends, unable to reach him by phone, went to check on him. The news of his death spread slowly. Russian media gave it minimal coverage, a few brief obituaries noting that a former military officer who had gained some international recognition had died. Western media, particularly in the United States and Europe, gave it more attention, with major newspapers running detailed obituaries explaining what Petrov had done and why it mattered. The United Nations held a moment of silence in his honor. Various peace organizations issued statements mourning his death and celebrating his legacy. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which maintains the famous doomsday clock measuring how close humanity is to catastrophe, published a tribute article. Stanislav Petrov was a man who at a critical moment chose reason over reflex, judgment over protocol, the bulletin's tribute read. His decision on September 26, 1983, may have prevented the most catastrophic event in human history. His death reminds us that the nuclear threat he helped avert remains with us, that we continue to live in a world where the survival of civilization can depend on the judgment of individuals in moments of crisis. Kevin Costner, who had befriended Petrov years earlier, released a statement. "A true hero has left us. Stanislav Petrov saved the world, and most of the world never knew it. I feel privileged to have met him, to have known him, to have looked into the eyes of a man who held the fate of humanity in his hands and made the right choice. We owe him everything." Petrov was buried quietly in Friazino, with a small ceremony attended by family members and a few close friends. There was no military honor guard, no Russian government representative, no official recognition from the state he had served. The legacy lives on today. More than 4 decades after September 26, 1983, Stanislav Petrov's story continues to resonate, continues to teach important lessons about nuclear weapons, human judgment, and the fragile nature of peace. The incident is taught in military academies, discussed in international relations courses, analyzed in books and documentaries about the Cold War. It serves as a case study in crisis decision-making, in the importance of critical thinking, in the dangers of over-reliance on automated systems. The story has also inspired artistic works. In 2014, Danish director Peter Anthony produced a feature-length documentary, The Man Who Saved the World, combining dramatic recreations with interviews of Petrov and others involved. The film brought Petrov's story to new audiences, particularly younger generations who had no memory of Cold War tensions. In 2018, a stage play based on Petrov's experience premiered in London. The Man Who Saved the World, the title had become standard, dramatized the events of September 26, 1983, focusing on the psychological pressure Petrov faced and the impossible nature of his decision. Various monuments and memorials have been proposed to honor Petrov. In 2018, a small memorial plaque was installed in Dresden, Germany, at the site where Petrov received the Dresden Peace Prize in 2004. The plaque reads, "In memory of Stanislav Petrov, who saved the world from nuclear catastrophe through calm judgment in a moment of crisis." There have been calls for a larger memorial, perhaps at the United Nations or at a site associated with nuclear disarmament efforts. As of 2025, no major memorial has been built, though discussions continue. What the story teaches us. The story of Stanislav Petrov offers multiple lessons that remain relevant today, even though the specific circumstances of the Cold War have changed. First, it demonstrates the fundamental fragility of nuclear deterrence. The theory of mutually assured destruction assumes rational actors making decisions based on accurate information. But Petrov's experience shows that information can be inaccurate, that systems can fail, that decisions must sometimes be made on instinct and incomplete data. 9 nations now possess nuclear weapons: the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. The total global stockpile remains in the thousands, though significantly reduced from Cold War peaks. As long as these weapons exist, the risk of accidental launch, miscalculation, or unauthorized use remains. Second, the story highlights the importance of human judgment in technologically complex systems. The OCO satellite system did what it was designed to do, detected what appeared to be missile launches and alerted operators. The computer followed its programming correctly. But the computer couldn't understand context, couldn't apply strategic logic, couldn't recognize that a 5-missile attack made no sense. Petrov's human judgment, informed by technical knowledge and strategic understanding, overrode the computer's assessment. In an era of increasing automation and artificial intelligence, this remains a crucial lesson. Some decisions require human judgment, human understanding of context, human ethical reasoning. Third, the incident reveals the importance of questioning authority and protocol when circumstances demand it. Petrov was trained to follow orders, to respect the chain of command, to execute procedures as written. But he recognized a situation where following protocol might lead to catastrophe, and he had the courage to trust his own judgment. This is a difficult lesson for institutions, particularly military institutions, which depend on hierarchy and obedience. How do you train people to follow orders while also empowering them to question those orders when necessary? How do you build organizations that are disciplined yet flexible, rule-bound yet capable of intelligent deviation from rules? The Petrov incident suggests there's no simple answer, that organizations must accept some degree of tension between obedience and initiative, between protocol and judgment. Fourth, the story reminds us of the role of individuals in history. Grand historical narratives often focus on leaders, movements, structural forces. But sometimes, history turns on the decision of a single person in a moment of crisis. Petrov wasn't a world leader, wasn't commanding armies, wasn't negotiating treaties. He was a middle-ranking officer on a routine night shift. And his decision mattered more than almost anything else that happened in 1983. This is both empowering and humbling. Empowering because it suggests individuals can make a difference, that one person's judgment and courage can change the course of history. Humbling because it reveals how precarious our existence is, how close we can come to catastrophe, how much we depend on the competence and wisdom of people whose names we'll never know. Ongoing nuclear risks. While the Cold War ended, nuclear risks remain. The United States and Russia still maintain large arsenals on high alert. Other nuclear-armed nations have developed increasingly sophisticated delivery systems. The threat of nuclear terrorism, non-state actors acquiring nuclear materials or weapons, has emerged as a new concern. The protocols and systems that govern nuclear weapons have improved since 1983, with better early warning technology, more robust communication between nuclear powers, and agreements to share information about missile launches to reduce the risk of misunderstanding. But the fundamental problem remains. Nuclear weapons exist, and as long as they exist, the possibility of their use, whether intentional, accidental, or unauthorized, remains. The Bulletin of the Atomic. Scientists' doomsday clock, which symbolically represents how close humanity is to catastrophe, stood at 90 seconds to midnight as of 2023, the closest it has ever been, driven by nuclear risks, climate change, and disruptive technologies. Organizations working toward nuclear disarmament often invoke Petrov's story as evidence of why eliminating nuclear weapons entirely is the only way to truly prevent nuclear catastrophe. We got lucky in 1983, they argue. We can't count on getting lucky every time. Others, supporting nuclear deterrence, argue that the lesson is different, that we need better systems, better training, better protocols to ensure that decision-makers like Petrov have the tools and information to make correct choices. Both sides agree on one thing. The incident of September 26, 1983 should never be forgotten, should remain a vivid reminder of how close we came and how vigilant we must remain. Remembering the quiet hero Stanislav Petrov did not seek heroism. He did not act with the intention of being celebrated or remembered. He simply made a decision based on his best assessment of the situation, applying his knowledge and judgment to an impossible problem. He spent the rest of his life uncomfortable with being called a hero, insisting he had just done his job, that any competent officer would have done the same. This humility, this refusal to claim special status, was itself remarkable. Yet his actions were heroic in the truest sense. Heroism isn't always dramatic, isn't always accompanied by speeches or visible bravery. Sometimes heroism is quiet, is a moment of clear thinking in a crisis, is the courage to trust your judgment when everything pushes you toward panic. Petrov showed a different kind of courage, not the courage to act, but the courage to pause, to think, to question. In a situation that demanded immediate reaction, he had the presence of mind to analyze, to reason, to recognize that what seemed obvious might not be true. He stood alone in that command center, with alarms blaring and crew members waiting for orders, with the fate of the world literally in his hands, and he chose reason over fear, judgment over protocol, thought over panic. For that moment of calm in the midst of crisis, for that decision to do nothing when every instinct and every order told him to act, Stanislav Petrov deserves to be remembered. Not as a superhuman figure, not as an impossible ideal, but as a human being who, when faced with an impossible choice, made the right decision, and in doing so, he saved the world. A final reflection. In September 1983, in a dimly lit command center beneath the Soviet countryside, a 44-year-old lieutenant colonel looked at a computer screen showing incoming nuclear missiles and made a choice. He chose to trust his analysis over the computer's assessment, to apply human judgment to a technological problem, to remain calm when panic would have been understandable. That choice rippled forward through time. Every person born after September 26, 1983, owes their existence in part to Stanislav Petrov's decision. Every achievement, every relationship, every moment of joy experienced in the past 4 decades exists because one man in one moment made the right choice. We live in the world Petrov preserved, though most people don't know his name, don't know the story, don't realize how close we came to never existing at all. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the greatest heroes are those whose actions prevent catastrophes that never happen, whose decisions ensure that ordinary life continues, who save the world so quietly that the world doesn't even know it needed saving. Stanislav Petrov died in 2017, largely unrecognized in his homeland, mourned by a small circle of friends and family. But his legacy lives on in every person alive today, in every child born since that September night in 1983, in every moment of human existence that might not have been. He was a man who, When alarms screamed and protocols demanded action, when every pressure pushed toward reporting what he knew might be false, when the easiest path was to follow orders and pass the responsibility upward, he paused. He thought. He analyzed. He made a judgment call. And he was right. In a dim command center with the weight of the world on his shoulders, Stanislav Petrov saved humanity with a quiet decision: to do nothing, to wait, to trust his judgment that the impossible was happening, that the warning was false. For that moment of calm in crisis, for that decision that preserved our world, we remember Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov, the man who saved the world by keeping his cool when it mattered most. Silent alarms in a forgotten bunker, a man who chose thought over panic, a world that continued because one person made the right choice. That is the legacy of Stanislav Petrov. That is why his story must never be forgotten.